Old Westbury, Long Island, September 1934. A 10-year-old girl walks down a staircase, and there are men she doesn't know standing at the bottom of it. They are not there to hurt her. They are there because a judge ordered them there, to make sure nobody else could take her first. Upstairs, a nurse named Emma Caselick packs a small bag. Outside, a car is waiting to take the girl to a courthouse in Manhattan, where more than 100 reporters have already claimed their seats. The girl's name is Gloria Vanderbilt. She is 10 years old, she is worth an estimated $5 million, and by the time this month is over, a New York judge will have heard testimony about her mother's lovers, her mother's parties, and a rumor about her mother and another woman that will shut the courtroom doors to the public entirely. Newspapers will call it the trial of the century. They will also give the little girl a nickname that follows her for the rest of her life, the poor little rich girl. She grows up to marry 4 times. She becomes a fashion designer whose name sits on the back pocket of half of America's denim in the 1970s. She becomes the mother of a CNN anchor, and in nearly 70 years of public life after this courtroom, in 4 marriages and dozens of interviews, she never says as much about who her family actually was as this trial says for her, without her permission, when she is 10 years old. That's what we're getting into today. Before we go further, if stories like this are the kind of thing you come back for, the family secrets, the old money, the version of history the society pages never printed, hit subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. I'll tell you when to come back for CTA number 2, because trust me, the worst part of this story hasn't even started yet. Let's go back to where it began, because to understand why Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney fought her own family for custody of a 10-year-old, you have to understand what the Vanderbilt name had already cost this particular branch of the family. It's not a pretty picture. By the 1920s, the name Vanderbilt didn't mean quite what it used to. Cornelius Vanderbilt built a shipping and rail fortune so large that by the time he died in 1877, he was reportedly worth more than the United States Treasury. His descendants spent the next 50 years finding increasingly creative ways to get rid of it. Mansions on Fifth Avenue, with 60 rooms nobody used. A cottage in Newport, with a ballroom bigger than most churches. By the time Reginald Claypoole Vanderbilt came along, great-grandson of the Commodore, the family had already burned through most of the discipline that built the fortune in the first place, though not, yet, the fortune itself. Reginald was charming. He was also, by most accounts, an alcoholic and a gambler, the kind of man who could lose a small fortune at the track on a Tuesday and not think about it again by Wednesday. He'd already been married once, to a woman named Kathleen Nielsen, and had a daughter with her, before that marriage collapsed under the weight of his habits. In 1923, at 42 years old, he married again. His new wife was 17. Her name was Gloria Morgan. She had a twin sister, Thelma, and the two of them had spent their childhood shuttled around European capitals, their father a minor American diplomat, their mother determined that her daughters would marry up. Gloria Morgan did exactly that. She married one of the richest men in America and became Mrs. Reginald Vanderbilt before she'd finished being a teenager. 14 months later, on February 20th, 1924, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt gave birth to a daughter. They named her after her mother, Gloria Laura Vanderbilt. Reginald did not get long with his second daughter. He kept drinking. 18 months after little Gloria was born, in 1925, he died. He was 45. What he left behind was complicated, in exactly the way old money likes to complicate things. There was a $5 million trust, and it wasn't for his widow. It was split between his 2 daughters, the grown one from his first marriage and the infant from his second, to be administered by the courts until each of them came of age. His widow got a much smaller settlement outright, along with a monthly allowance drawn from the trust to cover the cost of raising her infant daughter, $4,000 a month. In 1925, that was not a modest sum. It was a fortune on a leash. And that leash is where this whole story actually starts. Because a 20-year-old widow with a baby, a title by marriage, an international social circle, and $4,000 arriving every month with her daughter's name attached to it, is not a woman who's going to sit still in a nursery in Long Island. She wasn't built for stillness. Nobody in that family was. What Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt did with the years that followed is the reason this story exists at all. She crossed the Atlantic constantly, sometimes once a month: Paris, London, Biarritz, Cannes, Monte Carlo, Hollywood for a while, when that scene started calling to the international set. She was young, she was beautiful, she was a widow with a title and an income, and Europe in the late 1920s had a lot of uses for exactly that combination. Little Gloria mostly didn't come along. She stayed in New York and Long Island with two women who became, functionally, her actual parents. One was her grandmother, Laura Kilpatrick Morgan. The other was a Scottish nurse named Emma Caislick, who everyone, including the child, called Dodo. Dodo had been hired within 2 weeks of little Gloria's birth, and by the time the girl was 5, 6, 7 years old, Dodo hadn't missed a single day or night at her side. Not one. That's not a detail historians added for color. That's a fact both sides agreed on later, in court, under oath. So picture the actual shape of this childhood. A little girl in a big house, tended constantly by a nurse who loves her and a grandmother who dotes on her, while a mother who is legally responsible for her drifts through European hotel suites on an allowance technically drawn from the child's own inheritance. It's not neglect in the sense of nobody caring. It's neglect in the sense of the one person the law says is supposed to be there mostly isn't. On the other side of this arrangement was Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. She was Reginald's sister, which made her little Gloria's paternal aunt, and she was, in her own right, one of the more interesting women in that entire family. She was a serious sculptor. She'd studied under real teachers, exhibited real work, and in 1931 she'd used her own money to found what's now the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, because the Metropolitan Museum wouldn't take the collection of contemporary American art she'd offered to donate. This was not a woman who spent her life exclusively at parties. She built something that still exists a century later. She was also enormously wealthy, married to Harry Payne Whitney of the Whitney family, which meant two of the biggest fortunes in Gilded Age America had married each other, and she watched her brother's widow raise her niece from a distance, mostly through reports, and she did not like what she was hearing. By the early 1930s, Gertrude Whitney had started doing something that sounds almost paranoid until you remember how much money was actually on the table. She hired private detectives. She had household staff report back to her. She built, quietly, over months, a file on her own sister-in-law's private life, the parties, the men, the drinking, the long stretches where the mother of a young heiress was an ocean away from her. She was preparing something. She just hadn't decided yet whether she'd ever use it. Here's what tipped it. In 1934, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt fell seriously ill, and while she was recovering, apparently unable to fully supervise her daughter's care, little Gloria's grandmother and Whitney both grew convinced that the arrangement had become untenable. Whitney decided the file she'd been building for years wasn't going to stay a file anymore. She was going to sue her own niece's mother for custody of a 10-year-old child, in open court, in the middle of the Great Depression, with the Vanderbilt name attached to every headline. Understand what that meant for the country reading about it. This is 1934. Unemployment in America is somewhere north of 20%. Men are selling apples on street corners in cities where, a decade earlier, they'd had steady jobs. And here comes a story about people who are fighting over which mansion a little girl should sleep in. People so rich that $4,000 a month qualified as merely an allowance. It's easy to see why the country couldn't look away. It confirmed something people already suspected about wealth like that underneath it, nobody was actually happy. Gertrude Whitney filed the suit. The case would be called, formally, In the Matter of Vanderbilt, but everyone who covered it called it something else. They called it the Trial of the Century, and for once, that kind of headline actually undersold what was coming. Before the trial even opened, the temperature in this family had already gone somewhere strange. Guards were posted at the house in Old Westbury, on court order, to prevent either side from doing something rash with the child while the case was pending. Little Gloria, 10 years old, was living in a home with armed protection because two branches of her own family didn't trust each other not to grab her. And then there's the moment that, more than any other, tells you how far this had already gone before a single witness was sworn in. Court papers were served on Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, demanding she produce, in the language of the writ, the body of Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, before Judge John Francis Carew. That phrase, produce the body, is standard legal language for a custody order. It's a habeas corpus formulation, centuries old, nothing sinister about the wording on its own. But imagine reading that phrase in a newspaper next to a photograph of a smiling 10-year-old in a pinafore. It landed exactly the way you'd expect it to land on a public that already thought this family had lost its grip on reality. October 1, 1934. The courtroom opens. More than 100 reporters are packed inside, along with spectators who'd lined up for seats like it was a Broadway opening. On one side, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, 29 years old, defending both her fitness as a mother and, not incidentally, her access to an income that came through her daughter's trust. On the other, her sister-in-law, a woman with a genuine museum to her name, arguing that the woman across from her was too reckless, too absent, and too indifferent to be trusted with a child worth $5 million. Nathan Birkin represented the mother. He was one of the most prominent entertainment and personal lawyers of the era, a man who'd built a career representing composers and performers, and he came in swinging on the idea that this was, at its core, a fight over money, dressed up as a fight over morality. Herbert C. Smythe represented Whitney, and his strategy was simpler and, as it turned out, considerably more effective. He was going to let the witnesses do the talking, and he had spent years lining up witnesses who had a great deal to say. Before we get into what they actually said on that stand, and some of it is genuinely stunning even by today's standards, let's pause here. This is the part of the story where things stop being a family disagreement and start being a public spectacle that changes the rest of this little girl's life. If you want to see exactly how bad it got, and how a nurse, a chauffeur, and a French maid ended up putting an entire marriage on trial in front of the country, stay with me. But first, if you're finding this one as unbelievable as I did putting it together, do me a favor and drop a like on this video right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories, the ones that don't get told anywhere else. And if there's a family, a marriage, or a scandal from this era you want covered next, tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. Now let's get back into that courtroom, because what happened next is the reason nobody remembers this as a quiet custody hearing. The prosecution's case, if you can call Whitney's side that in a civil custody matter, rested almost entirely on the household staff. That's a detail worth sitting with. The people who did the most damage to Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt in that courtroom weren't rival socialites or gossip columnists. They were the people who worked in her own house, who had watched her private life up close for years, and who now stood up under oath and described it in detail to a room full of reporters. Emma Keislich, the nurse everyone called Dodo, was arguably the single most consequential witness. She testified that she'd seen Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt in bed with a man named Prince Gottfried von Hohenlohe-Langenburg, reading what the court transcripts described as vile books. A chauffeur took the stand, and described several other men in Gloria's life, describing a pattern of romantic relationships that painted the picture Whitney's team wanted painted. A mother who was rarely home, and when she was, rarely alone. Then came the testimony that actually stopped the trial in its tracks. A French maid described finding a woman named Nadejda de Torby, known socially as Lady Milford Haven, at Gloria's bedside, and testified that she witnessed the two women kissing in a way she described as intimate, not platonic. Judge Carew, who had reportedly said before the trial that he thought he'd heard everything a courtroom could offer, apparently had not. He closed the courtroom to the press and the public immediately after that testimony. The rest of the proceedings on that particular allegation happened behind closed doors. You can imagine what a closed courtroom does to a story that was already the most talked about trial in the country. It doesn't quiet the rumor, it supercharges it. Tabloids ran with the word outright lesbianism, printed in the kind of blunt, damning language that 1930s tabloid culture specialized in. More restrained papers found their own way to say the same thing, describing an alleged erotic interest in women, which was really just the same accusation wearing a slightly better suit. Either way, the implication was doing exactly what it was designed to do in a 1934 courtroom. It was framing Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, not just as neglectful, but as morally unfit by the standards of the era, in the most damaging way available. Outside the courthouse, something else was happening, that the trial coverage sometimes glosses over. Women showed up with placards. They weren't there for the scandal. They were there arguing for a mother's basic right to raise her own child, regardless of what her private life looked like. It's a genuinely early flicker of an argument that would take decades to gain real ground, that a woman's fitness as a parent shouldn't be adjudicated through her sexuality. In 1934, that argument didn't have a chance in this courtroom, but it was there, on the sidewalk outside, while the trial of the century unfolded inside. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt's side tried to fight back. Nathan Birkin attempted to characterize Emma Keislich, the nurse, as unreliable, even unstable, someone who had grown so attached to the child over a decade of caretaking that she'd become possessive, willing to say almost anything to keep the girl away from her actual mother. There's a version of this story where that argument has real teeth. A nurse who has spent literally every day and night with a child since infancy has an obvious, human motive to want that child to stay exactly where she is. That's not a wild theory. It's a completely plausible read of a woman's psychology. But it didn't matter, because Keislich's testimony wasn't standing alone. It was corroborated by a chauffeur with no obvious emotional stake in the outcome, by a French maid describing something she witnessed directly, and by the broader picture painted by 2 years of private investigators' reports that Whitney's team had assembled well before anyone stepped into a courtroom. One witness with a motive is a defense lawyer's opportunity. 4 separate witnesses telling overlapping stories is something much harder to explain away. The trial ran for roughly 7 weeks. 7 weeks of testimony, cross-examination, closed sessions, and a country reading about all of it in real time, because in 1934 there was no faster way to find out what happened in a courtroom than the next morning's paper, and papers across the country were putting this on the front page. It became, for a few months, the closest thing Depression-era America had to appointment reading. On November 21, 1934, Judge Carew delivered his decision. Custody of Gloria Laura Vanderbilt was awarded to her aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. But the ruling wasn't a clean severing of the mother's rights either. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt was granted visitation. Her daughter from Saturday morning until Sunday evening every week, 8 hours together on Christmas Day, and the entire month of July. It was, in the language of custody law, generous by the standards of the era for a parent who'd just been ruled unfit enough to lose primary custody. It was also, for a mother and daughter, a strange and clinical way to structure the rest of a childhood. One newspaper of the era, the New York Journal-American, summed up the verdict in a line that stuck for decades afterward. Up on a writ, Monday to Friday, mother's unfit. Saturday and Sunday, mother won't hurt you. It's a brutal, almost sarcastic way to compress what had just happened to a 10-year-old girl into a single newspaper sentence. But it's not inaccurate. There's a detail in the aftermath of this trial that gets less attention than the scandal itself, and it might be the most quietly devastating part of the entire story. Emma Keislich, the nurse who had spent every day of little Gloria's life at her side, whose testimony had done more than anyone else's to win Whitney the case, was dismissed by the judge shortly after the ruling. The woman who'd fought hardest to keep the child close to something stable didn't get to stay in that child's life either. Gertrude Whitney won custody, and then, according to multiple accounts, largely lost interest in her niece almost immediately once the legal victory was secured. The little girl spent her weekdays in Old Westbury with an aunt who wasn't especially present, and her weekends in a Manhattan hotel suite with a mother trailed by reporters and curiosity seekers every time she made the trip. So look at what actually happened here. A 10-year-old girl went into a 7-week trial fighting over who loved her more, and came out the other side having effectively lost both of them. The one adult who'd been unconditionally present for her entire life, gone. The mother she'd have wanted back, reduced to a supervised weekend guest. And the aunt who'd won the fight, functionally absent the moment the courtroom cleared. Gloria Vanderbilt didn't talk about this trial much in public for a very long time. When she finally did, decades later, in interviews and in her own writing, she described it less as a legal event and more as the moment she learned that being loved and being fought over were not the same thing, and that adults could do both to her at once, without either one actually being about her. What she inherited from this wasn't only money, although there was plenty of that waiting for her at 21 when she came into control of the trust her father had left. What she inherited was a template, a blueprint for what intimacy looked like among people with this much money, performative, contested, documented by staff, and ultimately decided by someone else's lawyers. And that template followed her. She married Pat DiCicco at 17, a Hollywood agent more than a decade older than her, a marriage friends and family reportedly saw as controlling almost from the start. She married the conductor Leopold Stokowski next, 42 years older than her, and had 2 sons with him before that ended too. She married the director Sidney Lumet. And finally she married the writer Wyatt Cooper, a marriage many who knew her described as the one where she was actually, finally, happy, and the father of her son Anderson Cooper, who would grow up to make his own career telling other people's stories on the news, in a strange echo of a childhood his mother spent as the story everyone else was telling. Here's the thing about all 4 of those marriages, and it's the reason this trial matters more than any one of them individually. Each marriage got its own headlines, its own gossip column inches, its own chapter in whatever biography or documentary decided to cover her life. But none of them, not one, exposed what a 7-week custody trial exposed about her when she was 10 years old and had no say in any of it. A marriage is at least a choice, however flawed, however influenced by a childhood you didn't ask for. This trial wasn't a choice. It was done to her, in public, by the 2 adults who were supposed to be protecting her from exactly that kind of exposure. That's the real subject of this story, not which husband was cruelest or which marriage lasted longest. It's the fact that the most defining event of Gloria Vanderbilt's entire life happened before she was old enough to understand the words being used to describe her own mother in a courtroom full of strangers, and that everything that came after, the fashion empire, the 4 marriages, the son who became a household name of his own, all of it happened in the shadow of something that was decided for her before she turned 11. Gloria Vanderbilt died in June 2019 at 95 years old, having lived through nearly a century of being the poor little rich girl, the fashion mogul, the socialite, the mother, the widow, 4 times over. She outlasted the trial by 85 years. She never fully outran what it made her. If this is the first video of ours you've watched, there are dozens more just like it. The marriages, the family fortunes, the scandals that got buried under decades of polite silence. Subscribe and hit the bell if you don't want to miss the next one, because there's always another family history hiding something worse than the version everyone was told. Thanks for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.